Welcome to everyone. First, I want to start by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kmahi, which is the ancestral territory of Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people. We are grateful for their hospitality, for the care they have taken of this land. And we acknowledge the treaties that were signed that did not cede the land, but that had a vision of coexistence and peace and friendship. We also acknowledge the indigenous peoples of all the territories of those who are joining us today by Zoom. And we acknowledge the history of people of African descent for 100 years in this place, and of the intertwining histories of indigenous, African, and all people who have settled in this place called Canada. So welcome to you all. We are here gathered for our panel discussion on business and finance in Black religious experience. I want to just make a few remarks to point out that religious spaces have been spaces where people have been able to meet, and not only to worship, but to foster their social and financial welfare. In Jamaica, where I'm from, the church was instrumental, especially post-emancipation, in helping to secure some financial benefits for the newly emancipated people. I'll just cite a few examples. One was the free village system, because one of the things that happened after emancipation is that laws were put in place to make it almost impossible for people to buy land. So some enslaved Africans had actually managed to save money, but they didn't have enough to buy big plots of land. So the Baptist Church in particular bought big plots of land and subdivided the land for the freed Africans. So places like Sligoville, which was the first free village in Jamaica, and other communities like that, were spaces where the church helped people to acquire land. Going on to the 20th century, we still had prejudice and lack of access to resources and financial institutions, formal institutions, by the majority Black population in Jamaica. And the credit union movement was actually started by the Roman Catholic Church as a way of helping people with limited means to access financial institutions. And there is a tradition that moved from Africa to the Caribbean and to Canada, among other places. We call it partner in Jamaica. The Trinidadians call it susu. And our Vice Provost, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Dr. Claudine Bonner, actually in her master's research found evidence of this practice in Cape Breton. So her master's thesis looked at, let's make sure I'm reading right here. Her unpublished master's thesis was entitled Industrial Island, African Caribbean Migration to Cape Breton, Canada. This was a 2017 MA thesis done at Dalhousie University. So I will quote a bit her description of this practice as it was carried out right here in our neck of the woods. So in part, the thesis reads, in addition to the work noted above, the women also found other creative ways of making and investing their own money. Among them, participation in a practice known as susu within the community. According to one woman, many of these women got together, and each week they would contribute their $5 or $10 And what you do is it would be called your turn. And it would be your turn one week and somebody else's turn the next. And each one would get a turn. I remember Mrs. So-and-so would have 2 or 3 turns because she would put in $15 instead of 5. So it meant that 3 times during this period, she would get 3 times the amount because that money would come to her. That was called susu by the woman, unquote. What she describes, Bonner continues, is a system of rotating credit, a concept arising from the cultural practices of African-descended communities and common throughout the diaspora. ROSCAs represent a type of savings and microcredit system arising out of the coming together of people who know and trust each other, usually living or interacting within a small community. This practice has allowed women the opportunity to take the monies earned in the informal economy into an accessible system of banking and credit. And so we are thankful for all of you who have come. We acknowledge the people of faith among us, for whom all that they do and the center of their lives is around belief in God or Allah or a higher being. And we are grateful for your offering your perspective and for others who join us in a congregation, in a conversation in this common enterprise of life together, regardless of our ethnic origin or religious or philosophical beliefs. So welcome to you all. I will just mention our panelists briefly. The biographies can be found on the chapel website. So we have Amy Haynes, who is an artist, an anti-oppression activist, and a candidate for ministry in the United Church of Canada. Amy will present her ideas on the critique of capitalism by some sections of the Christian faith. We welcome Julie Smith from the Great Emmanuel Baptist Church in Hammonds Plains, who ran a successful scheme in the congregation teaching financial literacy. Julie worked with the provincial government for over 30 years as an administrative assistant claims officer. And lots of things are going on. It's looking like Julie's life post-official retirement is even busier than when she wasn't retired.
Yes, for sure.
We welcome Sheikh Suleiman, a senior corporations field tax auditor with the Canada Revenue Agency and a distinguished Islamic scholar who will share with us some insights from Islam. And we have with us 3 lecturers from Acadia University, Assistant Professor Catherine Morton Richards from the Sociology Department, Professor Paul Callahan, the Director of the Manning School of Business, and Professor Hasuna Musa from the Department of Economics. So more about all of our presenters and reflectors can be found on the chapel website. But you don't want to hear me, you want to hear them. So I'll ask that questions and comments be placed in the chat and that we give them our full attention. So I'm going to ask Julie to start with Catherine responding. So over to you, Julie.
Well, thank you, Reverend Marjorie, for such an opportunity to come before you tonight. It was definitely a privilege and an honor to be here tonight to talk about financial literacy. And thank you, Catherine, for having my back here. So just thank you again for this amazing opportunity. And I hope, tonight, someone or many people will walk away with just one thing to apply to their financial being. So without further ado, I'm just going to share a PowerPoint presentation with you that I came, and I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see my screen? Good. Okay. So we're going to start off with my first screen, and we're talking about this is Black History Month. And the title of my presentation is Supporting Financial Literacy and Personal Integration of Generational Wealth in Congregations. Like I said, when I first came on, finance stuff can be simple or it can be complex. So I'm going to make it pretty simple tonight for everybody. So what is financial literacy? It's financial literacy is the ability to make informed judgments and to make effective decisions regarding the use and management of money. And it says, the difference between financial success and financial failure is how well you manage your money. It's simple. To master money, you must manage money. And believe it or not, many people at all levels of income struggle with this issue in their finances due to basically a lack of financial management skills. So my next screen, as it says, a bit of history, the relationship between the Black community population and intergenerational wealth. And I always believe that you have to talk a little bit about the past before you can move to the future. So before, I start talking about financial literacy, I need to help you better understand intergenerational wealth. And because if you don't understand that relationship between the Black community and the Black population regarding this wealth, then you will not understand the importance or the significance of financial literacy. Being a woman of God and being a Black woman, I'd like to give you just a bit of history on what intergenerational wealth means from a Black person, from my perspective. Since this is Black History Month, I would like to just give you, like I said, a bit of history on the lack of and non-existence of intergenerational wealth amongst the Black race. And unfortunately, historically, as slaves, the Black race were the source of labor to generate, economic and money for the white population. And therefore, we never were the recipients of generational wealth, unfortunately. And because we were never the recipients of generational wealth, financial literacy in this day and age is essential for the Black community to become educated and to become better, have a better understanding of what financial literacy is. And also it has given us a better, economical well-being. It is so crucial. It's crucial. I can't emphasize that enough for us to have a better understanding on how to manage the limited resources and the lack of information that unfortunately has not been provided to the Black community or the Black churches. And this is why I'm here tonight to really speak about how to support this financial literacy in our churches. And that was just a little bit of history on why we were not the recipients of intergenerational wealth. And then when I was writing this article, when I think about the Black communities and we are not the, recipients of generational wealth, one of the places that have and still suffer from this are churches. Churches struggles with this every day, especially in the Black communities, because back then they weren't educated, they weren't given the tools to be resourceful, to set money aside. And so what happens is, and I know a church right now that's trying to build a new church, because they weren't recipients of generational wealth, they are fundraising. They have to fundraise. They have to, look for different type of grants, and being a non-for-profit organization, those things are limited. So you're fundraising a lot of money that we weren't privy to. And it's so unfortunate because it takes them years to really get that financial money in place to build the churches. So this is why it's so important to talk about financial literacy when it comes to Black churches and to be supportive of this. It's nothing new, but unfortunately we weren't, educated on it. And so my next slide is just generally going to talk about supporting financial literacy in our churches. The church has a key role to play, and it really does. And I said, this is why the church, especially the Black church, has a key role to play in educating it, supporting, and equipping members with biblical principles. Why? Why? So the members can become good stewards of what God has entrusted you and me with. God lets us manage his money. He doesn't let us own it because we don't own anything. He owns everything. And so this is so important for us to follow God's ways of handling money, his rules. And also for us to enjoy, what it looks like to live a blessed life through financial independence. And when we experience blessed life, we can bless so many people. We can bless so many people, when we experience that. And also it's very important for the church to educate the congregation on financial literacy because the world principles are at the opposite ends and do not align with the biblical principles. The world principles are designed to create debt, but it doesn't give us the tools how to manage it. When I think about a young couples going to get mortgages, like they might be making 80,000, but a mortgage, people are saying, oh, you can afford $500,000. They're wanting to encourage debt, but not knowing how to manage it. And this is why we need to really look to God for his biblical principles. Why? Because for one thing, the world doesn't have our best interests at heart, but God does. He has our best interests at heart, and he can advise us, and we can trust him. Why? Because he loves us and he wants the best for us. And also, when the church supports financial literacy, we'll have a clearer understanding of God's plan for our life and control over our financial future. And I think that's so important. Wisdom is the principal key here. It says in the Bible, therefore get wisdom, and all you're getting, get understanding. And also it's very important for inheritance. For generations to be successful, it is so important to be provided with information and the tools to build wealth, to leave an inheritance to your kids and their kids and their kids. And the Bible is clear. The Bible is clear. And this is where I draw my strength and my wisdom from, because it's clear. It says in Proverbs 13:22, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. So my children, hers children, it continues on. And leaving an inheritance just doesn't mean that, you show them how to invest. You show them how to build their own businesses, to leave a legacy, how to acquire real estate, because we know today that's where it is. That's if you want to leave a legacy, start buying real estate and you can leave that to your kids. And I saw this quote by T.D. Jackson says, it's not what you leave to them that makes them great, is what you leave in them that makes them great. And I thought that was so profound. So we need to leave some good stuff in our children so they can carry on from generation to generation. And, when I think about this, but my great grandfather, this really touches my heart. He would have been like 100 and something now, but when he was a younger man, he had all this property in where we live up in Upper Hammers Plains, and he sold it for next to nothing because he didn't have any, mindset of financial stuff or resources or the skill set. He sold it for next to nothing. I saw advertised the other day, 8.3 acres, and my grandfather had acres of land. 8.3 acres of land are selling for $190,000. You think if he would have kept that land, how much we would have had intergenerational wealth in our families that we could carry on. So that's just some examples of why it's so important that we have financial literacy in our churches, and especially with the young people, especially with the young people. The young people need to say, oh, I'm only 18, I'm only 19, I'm not worrying about retirement. But we don't know. Those years go by so fast, and we cannot get those years back. So this is why I encourage young people, start investing now. Start changing your mindset, how you think about things, because it will change your life forever. And we also need to support financial literacy because knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. Basic financial knowledge is for everybody. It's for everybody. And like Reverend Marjorie said, I teach classes at church on financial literacy. And the age gap for the last one I taught was between the age of 27 and 76. What a huge gap in age. But guess what? Everybody can learn something. And the Bible says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. We are being destroyed because we are not getting involved in being educated and learning how we can manage our money, manage our everything, because God said He created us for wholeness. He wants everything whole in us, nothing missing, nothing lacking. That's our physical, spiritual, everything. He wants us to be whole. So when you have knowledge, people cannot convince you and rope you into the quick money schemes that's all out there now. When you have knowledge, you could say, no, that doesn't sound right. No, I know I have better resources. I can look into more things. So knowledge is power. And so we need to stay focused on that and get taught more about what financial literacy really means for you. And also, I just want to say about the personal and intergenerational wealth in congregations. Personal wealth, financial independence, and security. Like when you have financial independence and security, that opens up so many doors, especially for your kids. You can give your kids a better education. That way they can get better jobs, and then they can really sow into their personal well-being. Improves your environment. Every environment that you go to, church, whatever, you can bring more to the table because you have the knowledge and improves, and you're less stressful when you are comfortable in your financial, in your secure, you're carrying less stress for you and for your family. And one thing I love, you can be such a generous giver. When you have financial independence, you can give freely. And that's what God has called us to do, is to be givers of His money to bless other people. And I also talk about here intergenerational wealth. The kingdom of God, it continues to grow. When we have financial wealth in our church, it continues to grow. The ministries grow. Everything grows because we are sowing back into good ground. We're sowing back into God's kingdom. So God's kingdoms continues to grow because we are such good stewards of His money. And also the gift, when we have financial independence, is a gift that keeps on giving, and it will be passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation. And that's the whole purpose of intergenerational wealth. So it can be continually passed down. It's the gift that continues to give, and it keeps on giving and giving and giving. And so how do we break the cycle? We break this cycle by getting educated on financial literacy so we can sow those seeds into our kids, and they can sow them into their children. We need to break the cycle of the, poverty mentality. We need to break the cycle that God has blessed us with so much, and we need to get more educated when it comes to financial literacy. So I hope this touches somebody. It was just a small window of financial literacy, but this is a more of a complex area. But just for someone just to walk away, say, I need to get more educated. I need to find out more information on this. And it's something basic as just starting a budget. It's simple. Let's not make this complicated. So I just want to thank you for this opportunity. And now it's on to Catherine.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it, and such great comments here. I'm excited to see this conversation build because for me it's an education, but also it's things that I'm already talking about with students. Uh,
Okay.
First and foremost, thank you for being so generous with your own knowledge and your own experiences with this, because
Thank you.
part of that education, part of that building up the community capacity around financial literacy comes from a place of generosity for the people who will educate. And
Amen.
I just want to give that some space too, that there's a generosity and also, that same spirit of giving housed within education.
Yes, for
Um,
sure.
I'm so drawn to this history and this context that you framed for us so eloquently. Your statement of Black people being a source but not recipients of
That's right.
intergenerational wealth was so powerful because we talk about these historical wrongs as if they're dislocated from contemporary realities.
That's right.
And what you're tracking is that this chain is continuing. In
Yes.
that if we don't have the capacity for this intergenerational wealth, then we are continuing to see Black people, Black community, Black congregation as a site that is limited in their ability to build this intergenerational wealth. So I thought that context was really, really important.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
One thing I kind of wanted to ask about or maybe tease out about is that thinking through that history and how that history has been experienced intergenerationally as well, is how that history might frame some traumatic relationships
Hmm.
to financial literacy.
Yep.
Because I think about, especially for people that may experience parents living in poverty,
Yeah.
how difficult it is to then say, I'm going to take this on. I'm going to learn what potentially was an obstacle for the generation ahead of me. And I was wondering if maybe you had some reflections on whether or not you see, sort of the church as having this really important role, not only in facilitating or giving space to these opportunities for knowledge to build, but also in addressing that sort of trauma and that
Yeah.
pain intergenerationally through this violence of capitalism, which is
Yeah.
ultimately what we're talking about here. So
Absolutely.
I was
For
just
sure,
hoping to kind of get
because
your thoughts.
for one thing, it's a stigma behind it, right? And
Right,
like you say, it's trauma behind that. So, when you come to implement these type of courses, people kind of shy away, right? Because they are so hurt from the past, right? They don't want to expose themselves, right?
right,
And so to expose yourself, you have to go back into your past and
right,
deal with the root, right? What is the root cause? What has gotten you to this place to cause you to walk in fear or intimidation and struggle through this? So it goes back to people, you have to get to the root cause. And once you get to the root cause, you can address the issue. And this is what I found when I was doing this literacy course. A lot of it was deep rooted, and a
mhm,
lot of people was embedded with shame and the disbeliefs of financial literacy and financial abundance. Or we were meant to be poor, or whatever I get, I'm just keeping to myself. I'm going to hoard onto it. I'm not going to do anything with it. So the church, like I said, plays a big part because we have to break those barriers down and
mhm.
allow the space to be an honest, safe space for people to come to share their innermost feelings about why they struggle. Because they just don't struggle. They just don't wake up and say, oh, I'm struggling today.
Yeah,
No, that's been so ingrained in them. So, how do we get by that? By focusing on, okay, let's get to the root cause. What has happened that has caused this trauma in your life? Some could be back to slavery because nobody was educated to walk your generation through that and say, this is not the norm, right? We have a better future. God has promised us a better future. And this is how we're going to start walking through this gradually. It has to be gradually. It can't be just all thrown at you all at once. It has to be a process because we didn't get there overnight and we're not going to get out of it overnight. It needs to be a gradual. And then once you stop peeling back the layers, then you're going to see a change. And it's going to start with these courses and church starting to open up and allowing people to be vulnerable and say, you're not the only one that's going through this. But people shy away from those conversations. So people are meant to feel like they're the only ones. But in the big scheme of things, a lot of people are battling the same issue.
Right. Right. And as part of what I sort of see, in my own sort of assessment of just how capitalism sort of thrives in the idea of shame being connected
Yes.
to poverty, right? And I think about how individualized not only sort of the experiences, but also how solutions tend to be so individualized. And what
Yes.
you're describing is financial literacy is not just being individual, about being community, about being capacity building, about being intergenerational. And I think those linkages are so valuable because again, we do put too much emphasis on individuals to be in charge of their own experiences and to make their
Yeah,
own decisions, but they are part of broader structures, right?
absolutely.
I also really loved this idea of financial literacy, financial wisdom, as being the inheritance, that it's not
Yeah,
just passing on money or property, but it's also leaving in people the
that's it.
ability to make better choices or the ability to find ways to leverage their own skills and assets. And, I'm thinking through this idea of good stewards too.
Yes.
And even just thinking back to Reverend Marjorie's land acknowledgements and the importance of sort of recognizing, how temporary our role as stewards is in all of these sort of structures. I'm really drawn to your reflections too on the impact of the lack of intergenerational financial education on churches as institutions too. Just in terms of either churches struggling financially, in terms of, not having sort of the endowments because of this lack of knowledge. And I'm wondering if you see either through your own experience so far, or maybe moving forward, if you scale up your experience, what sort of partnerships exist in the community to build these programs even further. And if you've thought through maybe some ways to help bridge this divide where there's an over reliance on seeking out very limited pools of either grant money or volunteer support. If you could sort of comment on that too.
Well, like in the church, it's unfortunate because a lot of churches like to do their own thing, unfortunately. But if we became more unified and came together and pooled together our resources, then it will open up doors because people will start talking to people more about these grants and not just thinking, it's just my church dealing with this. No, if you pool your resources together, everybody can benefit from that knowledge. And I think that's what's happening. People are not joining together and saying, okay, did you know that this grant is out there? Did you know that this grant is out there? And then it will give people more knowledge and you're not reinventing the wheel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I
Mm-hmm.
find that's happening. People are reinventing the wheel when somebody else out there already knows that it exists.
Right.
Right. So I think it's a collaboration. It has to come together. Churches have to come together more and congregate and say, what do you guys have on the table? How can we help you? Because we've been down this road. So we know the avenues, we know the buttons to push. We don't want you to reinvent the wheel when we have already been on the wheel.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And that idea of being able to find these synergies, right, is so important here. Just as sort of a final thought, I'm really interested in the work you've already done, and I'm curious to know in particular if something stands out as sort of the most important, maybe most surprising finding from your own work in terms of like either a gap you didn't anticipate or maybe something that people really took from your teaching that they really ran with. If there's just sort of a takeaway from that experience that's sort of fueling you now.
Well, it was so much I took away from it, right? It was amazing the caliber of people that were there. You had single mothers that was at this course, then you had doctors.
Right.
So you think about the gap there and people having the same mindset. I'm making 300,000, but I'm broke, right? But then you have someone there that's making 40,000 and says, I'm managing my money, but I just want to have more skills to manage it even better. So when like that, because we have this preconception notion that just because you make more money, you have more money. And that's so far from the truth. It's how, like I said, my first slide, how you manage your money. And
Right.
so when I saw all that and the dynamics of that, I said, we just kind of look at people say, oh, they're a doctor, oh, they have it all together. But that's so farther from the truth. And so to see that happening and people being vulnerable and opening up, say, yeah, I'm a doctor, but I don't have no money. Because why? I never budgeted. I never had this training. I never even applied a budget. I don't even know what a budget is.
Right.
Something so basic, right? And this is what I say, a basic budget can really put you in the right direction, honestly and truly. And so when I walked away from that, I was so excited about what was accomplished in 9 weeks. It just blew my mind of how people just grasped and how people was paying off their credit cards and was paying their debt down only because of a few concepts that they did not understand or didn't know about, right?
Right.
And so it gives me excitement when I see that happening because I'm like, you know what? We're in this together. It's taking small steps, one step at a time. Don't beat up on yourself because you're because you didn't, like I said, didn't get there overnight and you're not. Just one baby step at a time, one step at a time will get you closer to financial freedom. And I always say this, and I always leave with this. People don't plan to fail, they fail to plan.
Oh, it's a great thing to leave off on. I really I appreciate this conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing the other speakers. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome, Catherine. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Wow. Sometimes when you get women together, some interesting things happen. So thank you both for the very creative and dynamic way in which you decided to have the conversation. So I'd like to ask Sheikh Suleiman to go next and for Paul then to respond. Okay, we don't have Sheikh Suleiman with us yet. All right, so we'll go to Amy. Are you ready? Ready, set, go.
Always ready, born ready.
Okay.
If you stay
So
ready, you don't have to get ready.
So we'll ask you to go next. Thank you.
Sure, I would love to. Let me just get my presentation set to go and share with you all. Also, just before I start, I'll just say thank you for having me. I'm so excited and honored to be here. Thank you, Julie and Catherine. It was good to listen to you both. I wish I could jump in because I am a kid who's pretty good with money. So I learn how to make a little be a lot, and it served me well. So let me just get this here, and we will go. Okay. Is everybody able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, amazing. So I'm going to be doing in supposedly 7 minutes a Reformed Church critique of neoliberalism. I was joking before everybody came in with John there that I somehow always end up pulling this straw in presentations where I'm tasked to describe a really big concept in a really small amount of time. So this does not and cannot be comprehensive in its scope, but I hope that it provides a bit of an understanding of the topic here. I wanted to start today by just talking about socially, how we are in a world, I feel, that is longing for unity. So much of the conversation is today, whether financial, economic, or otherwise, is around the fracture of people. And I refer to the wonderful Dr. Richard Twiss, who is an Indigenous theologian who says you can't have unity without diversity. And so being that we are in Black History Month, as a biracial Black activist, artist, mother, and kind of budding theologian myself, I think that's a really important place to start, so that we can reclaim, as Black people in particular, but certainly all other people of color, can bring our stories and our experiences that stem out of a history of colonization and offer great gifts to the world. So what is neoliberalism anyways? No big deal to describe that. Of course, we'll all have different understandings and come to the table today with different understandings. So I want to just start by saying that the meaning of this term is contested, and some economists and economic philosophers reject the term entirely. This is often associated, this term, with the left and left-leaning ideals, and it tends to be rejected by those who oppose social democratic reform. It comes out of the 19th century and was sort of reinvigorated as a term of common parlance in the 30s, as sort of a callback to some of those classical liberal ideas about economic philosophy. And it basically favors a free market, unmitigated capitalism, laissez-faire economics, if you've heard of that as well. And the Accra Confession, which I will reference shortly, defines it as such, and I will read directly from there. Talks about economic globalization as containing the following beliefs: a belief in unrestrained competition, consumerism, and the unlimited economic growth and accumulation of wealth are best. They see that as being best for the entire world. The ownership of private property has no social obligation. Believes in capital speculation, deregulation of the market, privatization of public utilities and national resources, unrestricted access for foreign investments and imports, lower taxes, and the unrestricted movement of capital, believing that this will achieve wealth for all people. It lacks in social obligations, protection of the poor and weak, trade unions. It is not really a relational philosophy in terms of respecting and encouraging relationships between people, because people are subjugated to being consumers and labor. And so rather they become subordinate to the processes of economic growth and capital accumulation. So it tends to define itself in today's world, in our global world that we live in today, as an ideology that's sort of without an alternative. And so the poor are sort of endlessly, it seems, exploited in such a way. So I want to talk about this idea of neoliberalism as a bastion of freedom, and really break down what we're talking about when we talk about freedom. So I should have put quotes here in terms of common understanding, because is there really a common understanding? I think some of us would say that we understand freedom as democratic rights, as freedom of movement, autonomy, bodily autonomy, being able to have free speech. But then we see in today's society, freedom has also different meanings depending on who you talk to. Some people may talk about the vaccine protests that we've seen over these COVID years. Some people think it's freedom, you're not free unless you have any kind of gun that you want. There's a freedom that is being expressed around freedom to define gender for oneself, sexuality. I think a lot of the conversation of freedom has to begin with an analysis of power and agency and how those two are exercised and their relationship to one another. That's a broader conversation, but I think it's a good place to start thinking. The Accra Confession defines freedom differently. It acknowledges God as creator. It acknowledges that the priority should be to act in a way that preserves the life of the planet and human life, calling back to our former speaker to be stewards, a human duty to care for the planet, to do justice and be ethical, and base our ethics around covenants that come from our relationship with God as created beings and creatures. I think the Accra Confession calls the church, names where the church has gone in lockstep with a neoliberal approach, with a colonial approach, and says, hey, we're complicit here and we are called to repentance. I want to talk about now the biblical basis of freedom, because I'm here as somebody who is a candidate for ordination in a church that, at least in part of its origin, is reformed in tradition. And there's a couple of biblical verses that I'll call your attention to. The first being from Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, which you can see here. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourself be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. I think that we obviously understand as African people of the African diaspora, especially those who have come from Caribbean traditions, American traditions, Canadian traditions, we understand the legacy of slavery on our people, on our ancestors, and on even today as we learn about intergenerational traumas. But slavery is literally that, but there is also a slavery that we can talk about in terms of an oppressive economic system. And I think that's important to analyze. Secondly, we go over to Galatians again in chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. And it's written, my sisters and brothers, you were called to freedom. Serve one another in works of love, since the whole of the law is summarized in a single command. Love your neighbor as yourself. We see in this economic climate that there is a lack of equality, that there is this huge wealth disparity in terms of even looking at just the COVID years, corporations becoming richer, shareholders becoming richer, the deep and extensive pressure on those of us who are called to be consumers, who are buying things. As a mother of 2 children, I can tell you that what I pay to feed us all today is so much greater than it was even last year at this time, or the year before that, or 5 years ago. And it's not just because my kids are bigger and eat more. I'll go over to this quote here from the prophet Isaiah in chapter 61, verse 1. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, also translated as bring good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners. Release even perhaps to those of us imprisoned in an oppressive economic world. I also want to draw our attention to the time when Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, quotes Isaiah here. Jesus had previous in Luke, at the beginning of Luke, goes through temptation in the wilderness. And the devil says to him, turn this rock into bread. And Jesus says, well, one cannot only live by bread, one must also live by the Spirit. And I think of that and interpret that and exegete from that there is a life of spiritual freedom that is not only about what we can possess, buy, and eat, but also what is just and right in our spirit. Jesus leaves that ordeal of temptation and goes on to hang out in Galilee for a bit and preaches and has a great time, and then goes over to Nazareth, where he's from. He rolls out the scroll of Isaiah and he quotes again, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to proclaim good news to the poor. And I think that the good news cannot possibly be that you must be poor and subjugated forever. Because just after that, he says the scripture is fulfilled in the hearing of it. And so how I interpret that is that once we hear this good news, we are empowered to get on with the mending of the world, to act as co-creators with God in bringing a just system, a just world to be here in the here and now. We must not only wait for freedom sometime after death in a world that we can imagine based on our scripture, but that we don't know. Freedom can be here. We can witness the kingdom as as was said before, breaking out here and there in this world. And so how do we do that? For me, I think it's really important that I reject any and all philosophies that reduce me only to my labor, that make my body only a vehicle of what can be produced and what can be attained, and silences my contributions as a Black woman. I think it's really important that we reclaim our stories, our gifts, the wisdom of our ancestors. I loved that Dr. Lewis began by talking about a susu. That was really cool to me because I've heard of those, and actually during COVID, I believe in Trinidad, a bunch of money was seized actually by the government of Trinidad from a susu because it was misunderstood by a colonial government to be in alignment with some kind of a pyramid scheme. So I think that's an interesting connection. But I think that we must not only reclaim, but enact our radical resistance in resting. So much of what we understand about our culture is that we must be on a grind, we must accumulate, we must buy and do all the time. We're pushed to the edge of what is actually possible, and we're supposed to do it all. And we're supposed to look good doing it, particularly as women. I think to say no, to rest, to say that our bodies require a soft place to land is in fact a deep resistance to a system that will take us to breaking points. And I think we must also resurrect our joy as Black people, our laughter, our humor. Most of us know that when we get together, we laugh and find an ease. And I hope that we can find that ease in the world, even as we witness in many places that the world wants to take that from us. I think that Black resilience that comes from our ancestors and our elders, that reveals itself as a deep bodily knowing for many of us, is a balm, in fact, not only for us, but a balm for the world. And I think that as we do face the immense challenges that we all know about, particularly those of an economic oppression and an extractive economy that distances us from our identity as creatures in creation, with God as our creator and in us as faithful stewards, we must reclaim our agency. We must say that because this philosophical economic failure of neoliberalism is that we are reduced to consumers over created blessings. And I think that our light, all of our light, our Muslim light, our Christian light, our Jewish light, our Buddhist light, our atheist light, our Sikh light, all of that is required and gifted to us by the Spirit to be co-creators in mending this world. The world sees so much darkness, and our light is called to speak truth to power and to create a world where everyone is able to thrive in abundance. I think that this particular economic perspective cannot actually validate us. It cannot actually bring us to freedom in that. And I say this as a person who is a Christian. I think that this way of viewing the world, of participating in the world, is an evil. It is what Paul would say is a power and principality. But I think that there's good news in Scripture, and we must not only wait for it, but we must enact a season of Jubilee in the here and now. And the beautiful thing about Jubilee is that Jubilee speaks of rest, not only rest for the people, not only cancellation of debt for the people, but rest for the land, because we face this existential crisis of climate emergency, and our economic policies have so much to do with that. And I think that I feel really connected to share this, an excerpt of the new creed from the United Church of Canada. We are called to be the church, to celebrate God's presence, to live with respect in creation, to love and serve others, to seek justice and resist evil, to proclaim Jesus crucified and risen, our judge and our hope. Now, what this says to me is that as the church, we cannot stand consistently in lockstep with these neoliberal values. And that's what was done in Accra. They made this confession. It's part of the tradition of the Reformed Church. It's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer did in terms of confessing his faith in light of the Nazis in Germany in World War II. We confess, we proclaim what we see in the world, and we speak a prophetic word against what we see. And I think that if I was to try to attempt to do that now, I would say, let us rest the earth. Let us rest ourselves. Let us retire a paradigm of oppression and inequality, because I believe that our Black stories can lead the way. I believe that our Indigenous wisdom can lead the way. I believe that immigrant wisdom and stories can lead the way. May our diverse experience speak a word of truth and of hope to a world longing to be united. Let us live our lives as future ancestors. May it be so.
Thank you very much, Amy. We're in one of these moments when things aren't going quite the way I planned it, but I think it will go the way it should go. So I'm wondering, I would like to invite our presenters, members of the audience, if they have any questions or comments, to please pop them in the chat. I see powerful thank you, and I can feel the brains ticking over. So please share your comments and questions with us in the chat. We want to welcome Sheikh Suleiman and thank him so much for coming. We're just trying to set up his PowerPoint. So give us 2 minutes to do that. But in the meantime, I wonder if any of the other presenters had any quick comments at this point.
I'm scared Paul's going to unmute because I'm a lay person. I told you when I said yes to this invitation, I'm not an economist. I'm an activist. And so when I saw Paul there, when you introduced him, I said, oh no, not the head of the department.
No, I mean, it was a beautiful, articulate conveyance of feelings and views and thoughts. It was great. I enjoyed it, and I certainly am not Captain Capitalist here trying to respond to any. So I enjoyed it. I wasn't making notes because well, I'm getting ready for the next one.
Okay, thank you very much. And so I'm going to ask John Scott to go ahead with the PowerPoint that Sheikh Suleiman sent, and welcome again, Sheikh Suleiman. We we met through a mutual friend, and I'm really grateful for your joining us and participating in this way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody, and good evening. So what's the protocol? Are we starting or are we waiting for?
I'll ask you to go ahead, please. The other presenters have spoken already.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. My name is Sheikh Suleiman, as the Reverend said, and I am Imam in about 2 or 3 mosques here in the GTA. And I also work with the Canada Revenue Agency. I'm a senior corporations tax auditor. And interestingly, I also lead a project to establish a credit union for the Muslim community. And we'll talk about that a little later. Next slide, please. So I was asked to talk about lending and borrowing at interest in Islam. So what does Islam say about lending and or borrowing? Of course, it's the other side of the coin, and is interest allowed to be charged or not? And then at the end, I'm also asked to talk about Islamic mortgage. So as you can see, interest is strictly prohibited in Islam. So a borrower or a lender, normally we will expect the lender to be the one that imposes the interest. But then Islam looks at both parties and says, unless it is strictly unavoidable, if somebody has got no way to survive, and the only means is to borrow money, and that's the only way, and the lender imposes, in this case it's unavoidable because they have to survive. But out of the leisure of their lives, they decide to go to the bank or to the lender and borrow and agree, then Islam also prohibits this for both parties, because they say, as they say, it takes two to tango. And then Islam had also laid down steps or approaches to further discourage borrowing or lending at interest. So Islam encourages the one who lends the money, the one who borrows the money to ensure that they pay it as soon as possible. So as you can see on the screen, there is no perpetuating of indebtedness. So it is almost obligatory that the one who borrows the money should try their best to repay. And if they don't pay, the scriptures teach us that they will be sinful no matter how righteous they are at death. So this is to further discourage people from, of course, if you borrow money from someone and you promise to pay and you don't pay and you die, you have taken the right of somebody away with you. Of course, there are arrangements that are made separately for someone to stand and make sure they repay the money. But as much as the borrower had borrowed from a lender who had been generous to lend to sort of bail someone out, the borrower is also highly encouraged to repay. It's almost obligatory that you repay it as soon as you get the money, you should repay. And even when someone dies, we're saying the debt must be paid first before anything else, before bequeathing or before distribution of the estate. So a story I wanted to mention in the ancient times was this part of the traditions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So two people came to agreement for the lender to lend 1,000 dinar. When we say dinar, in those days, it used to be gold coins. So equivalent of 1,000 of it. So the borrower wanted to take this money and go overseas to trade. So they agreed and made an agreement when this money will be repaid. So the borrower said, I will return on this day and repay the money. So he went overseas and the lender was expecting. So the day came and the lender went to the shore expecting the borrower to come back and repay him his 1,000 dinar. He never came. So the ship came and then everybody embarked out of the ship and this person was not there. Meanwhile, this person overseas he came late and the ship was gone. So he was contemplating, he didn't want to break his promise, but he had no other way to go overseas. So he chopped some planks of trees and then he put them together, and then he tied this money, and then he put them inside these planks and tied them and threw them over the water, and says, God Almighty, I have made a promise. I have not been able to fulfill it because I have missed the ship, but I wanted this money to go back as promised, and I depend on your majesty to help me deliver this. So after some time, he was able to board a ship to go over to meet this person. Meanwhile, this person was just by the sea, and he didn't get, he didn't find this borrower. So he said, well, I have nothing to do. Let me, go back. And then he saw this, these planks on the sea. And he said, maybe I'll take this and make some firewood and cook something, whatever I can get. So he started chopping off the planks, and then he found the money and the note. So this guy finally this guy got the ship, he found another ship, and he came over and he took another 1,000 gold coins to repay this person. And the lender said, but you've sent me the money, you've paid. He said, how do you know? You never saw me, I never came. And then he told him that I was by the seashore expecting you, and this thing came, and I saw the note. And that is how, so this is a trust that when you lend money or you borrow money, the lender had actually come to the rescue. And so the borrower is also obligated to pay. And there was no interest involved, because the trust and the dependence on God Almighty should suffice. Next slide, please. Next slide. So as we said, the borrower is strongly encouraged to repay. And the tradition of the Prophet ﷺ was that so there was a time he had no food at home, and he went to a Jewish neighbor in Medina to borrow foodstuffs, and he took his armor that he defends his home and his family, and gave it to the Jew as a collateral. So in Islam, and as a matter of fact, in simple English, we say he mortgaged his armor to get foodstuffs, to provide a security and assurance to his neighbor that I promise to repay this money, but if I don't, at least you have something. And this armor was more valuable than the foodstuffs he borrowed. So what we're saying is, even if you borrow money, you should put something, but it should be willingly. It should not be imposed upon you, but you should be generous enough to give as much security to the lender as possible. And then when it comes to repayment, the Prophet ﷺ always repaid more. So if I borrowed $1,000 from Reverend Manning, for example, and then the time comes for me to pay, I am strictly highly encouraged in Islam to pay 1,200, 1,100 without her imposing anything on me. Why? Because it avoids social greed, it avoids financial inequality. And we know that the story of Shylock, who will lend money, and if people are unable to pay, of course, he will he would demand for the pound of flesh. Now, interest is looked at as promoting exploitation. Somebody is not, somebody is unable to, we're not all equal. God Almighty has created this earth. And as long as we live on this earth, everybody has his or her share. But not everybody, can equally earn the same. We're not the same. So those people who have been endowed with position and power and the intellect to be able to make more or have better better living conditions should be able to help the downtrodden one. The ones who are unable to do it doesn't mean they shouldn't, they are not smart, but this is nature. They said the fingers are not the same, even in the same body. So we should be able to come together, those who do have, to be able to help those who don't have. Indeed, some people, because they inherit or they're born from royal families or from politicians, from positions, so they get into they get to taste the life much better than others. But it doesn't mean that we should exploit others. So Islam actually discourages exploitation. It discourages financial inequalities. Yes. So if you look at the concept of zakah, for example, Islam imposes 2.5% tax on the rich. So we call it wealth tax. It is actually on the savings that someone had saved for a year. You don't need it for expenses or anything. It's not from income, it is from extra saving. So you take 2.5% and you give it to those who don't have it. There are 8 categories, including those who are indebted, so that it will eliminate poverty, it will eliminate social inequalities. So what is the role of banks? The banks of today, they lend money and they charge interest. But the banks themselves don't have the money. They never own the money. So why should they take my money, your money, everybody else's money, and give it back to us and charge us interest? Now the interest that they charge higher and they give us, what is lower. So it's the same with the private banks and the private lenders. The state banks are supposed to come to the rescue. They're supposed to give loans to those who are unable to, who don't have the means, at interest free. What they should do is, Islamically, Islam says when you want to lend money to someone, you should find out what they want to do with the money. So the state is best positioned to do this, to lend the money and encourage this person to trade or invest or do something that is productive, so that you can share part of the profit. Profit sharing is absolutely allowed in Islam. Now, if they don't make profit and you keep charging them interest, that interest, if for those who know finance, there are certain amounts and periods of borrowing that, and the rates of interest that could actually equal or surpass the original amount. So that means you've wiped out the capital that they've even borrowed, or even to invest or to make profit, that has been wiped out. So how are they going to survive? So the state banks in Islam are encouraged to actually come to the rescue. So if you look at the concept of state banks in Islam, it is not just pure money. So those who trade, those who farm, they all harvest the equivalent of 2.5. Everybody brings it into the bank, and the bank in Islam is called Baitul Mal, meaning the house of wealth. So you find currencies, but you also find foodstuffs, you also find fruits and crops and merchandise. Everything is there. As long as it's 2.5% and it's saved over the year or it's harvested, it's put there. And then Islam stipulates 8 categories of people who will come and take from this: the poor, the needy, and among them, the one who is in debt. So to bail somebody out of debt, these state banks are encouraged to come to administer these. Next slide, please. So we talk about halal mortgage. So I'm saying, normally when you talk about you hear about mortgage, the advertisement has been that you have to go to the bank or the financial institution and make an agreement to borrow money to buy a house or something and pay interest. But as we said, and we saw it, mortgage is also to put something as a security or collateral willingly against something you borrow. So what Islam is saying is the advertisement of what is mortgage should not be one-sided. It should make people understand that if you have something that is valuable, you can put it against borrowing money, for example. So you have a house or anything, an asset, and you needed money, you can put that asset, and the lender should not impose conditions on you that you will not be able to, unbearable conditions. Now, so if you look in Islam, the mortgage is cost plus. So I want to buy a house for 500,000, for example. It is okay for the bank to say they're going to sell it to me at 700,000, 750,000. So the profit of the bank is 250,000. As long as I agree to pay, now we have to look at this 700,000 over how long can I pay, how much can I pay, and what else can I put as a collateral willingly. So Islam eliminates that interest, but it gives the profit, it provides avenue for the lender to make a profit. So, and if the way it works these days is I don't have the money to pay, so part of it, so it's going to be a on a pro rata basis that I will pay part of what I can pay, and part I'll pay rent until I'm able to pay over the time period of what I owe to the lender. So the earliest credit unions. So we talk about state banks and private banks and private lenders. So the story was that in Europe, somewhere in Germany, a village, and also some stories said in Japan, these poor people were not allowed to go to the bank to borrow because, first of all, the banks impose this interest on them that they were not able to pay. But also the bank is afraid that they are so poor that they won't be able to repay the debt. So they came together in the village, and then so they contributed. They said, okay, whoever needs money or credit, we will lend it to this person. Now, on top of that, if the time comes to pay and this same person is unable to pay, they contribute additional money to pay for the debt. So this is how the concept of credit union came into being. Unfortunately, today, credit unions are charging as much interest, if not more, than the banks. But what credit unions are supposed to do is to form or establish a communal financial institution where everybody is a member. So every credit union actually has members, which is completely different from the banks as a private. But unfortunately, they also impose interest upon their members. What they should have done was to trade or to support those who invest or trade. And then when they make the profit, they share the profit among their members. So to conclude, I was, as I said at the beginning, I'm leading a project to establish an Islamic credit union where the Muslim community in the GTA will come together and pool their resources together so that whoever wants to, the name credit means people who, of course, don't have enough. So we will give them a credit, but we also support them that this credit is productive. If they buy any house, of course, we will have to invest part of that money in the credit union to help them. In addition to the down payment and the regular payments, there is what we call parallel investment that will help them. In other words, Islam encourages profitability, but discourages interest, because interest, the lender may just sit and do nothing, just lend money to people and keep imposing interest. And you don't know, perhaps these people are not able to make as much profit as that interest. So whatever profit they make, if the interest is higher, then the interest actually, essentially it wipes out the profit. So they continue perpetually be in debt, and God knows when they will be able to pay. And I think that brings me to the conclusion of, I think I have 7 minutes. I'm not sure if I've exceeded it, but I hope whatever I've said is beneficial, and then I can take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Sheikh Suleiman. We are coming to the end of our time together because we had said an hour and a half. So I'm going to ask everybody's indulgence if we can take about 5 minutes more so that we can give Paul space to give us his good 7 minutes of response to Sheikh Suleiman.
Sure.
So right over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Reverend Marjorie, for inviting me, and thank you, Sheikh Suleiman, for your presentation. It was entertaining and interesting, and I'm not going to directly question your, at least not initially, your presentation. I just, you know, having this opportunity to think about this topic was interesting because I had never really contemplated before. And I'm not here to be a defender of capitalism, as I already said, but I want to point out that I found it very interesting how the religious history has questioned, all faiths have questioned loans for interest in my bit of research I did here. So that was interesting to me. And then it started me thinking, as that opposition or condemnation, if you wish, of charging interest for loans evolved, how it reconciled that with modern economic practice in capitalistic systems. And that's, you know, what I learned a bit about, and you made some reference to it in your presentation, you know, with how they, you know, collateral is alternative forms of collateral.
Yeah.
And so forth.
Yeah, Islam provides steps for you know, for that assurance for repayment, but also encourages. Islam is not against capitalism. Islam is against exploitation, right? So
right.
We have to. So if somebody borrows and they can invest, and then there's nothing wrong. Then, you know, even so, the lender can share part of that if that is what the lender does, right? But to just give people money and charge exorbitant interest to a point where they are unable to pay, and then it becomes a collections issue, or then, you know, eventually, you know, I mean, people are not the same. Some people just can you know, go over. So we have to be able to come to this is humanity. We should be able to share to
yeah, and that's some of the shared opposition to it was the sense that too often it was the taking advantages of others' misfortune, and also that it became a legal issue of charging reasonable rates that are codified by law around Roman times. Apparently, that they started to recognize, Christians, that while some lending was okay, but we have to regulate and make it fair. But it's also interesting that there was you know, this shared belief of lending should really be about charity. You know, it should be about helping your community. And I found, you know, in my reading in Judaism, that it was in the Torah, it says, "Thou shalt not lend upon interest to thy brother, interest of money, interest of victuals, interest of anything that is lent upon interest. Unto a foreigner they mayest lend upon interest." But unto thy brother thou shalt not lend interest, that the Lord thy God may bless thus in all thou purest thy hand, on all thy puttest thy hand on, and so forth.
Yeah, Islam made everybody a brother and a sister. So for Islam, whether you are a Muslim or not, if we lend, we don't charge interest. Yes, and if we borrow, we don't pay interest.
Yeah, so just an interesting observation, and so it goes on, you know, that there are these common traditions of lending for interest is not justifiable until you can, you know, until we start making up reasons that you can justify certain fees, like you suggested, that, you know, you'll just call it a fee instead of interest. Well, that's a little bit of sheep in wolf's clothing there. But
well, yes, fees is, so if fees, so let me flip it. Islam looks at tangible costs. So if you charge a fee to be able to, if somebody is a lender and has got people that work for him or her, and they have an office, so they have reason to charge fees to pay for their expenses. So this is fine, as opposed to stipulating some percentage and compounding, you know. So yes, in a way they could be the same, but they could also diverge at some point. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and so ultimately, I think that, you know, as I read this in this topic, ultimately, you know, what is the value of money, and until we, if we have a shared vision or understanding of what the value of money is, then we can come to terms, if you wish, on what is acceptable, regardless of our faith, and it's you know, there is risk in lending a person money. Because that person may not honor that. There is consequences of the passage of time. Money today is not the same as valuable as money in the future. So there has to be a shared understanding of that, of course. And Julie highlighted that in her reminiscence of her grandfather's owning land, that what it was worth today. And Amy made reference to it too, I think, in the price of food today, feeding your children is not the same as it was 2 years ago. And then the third thing is opportunity costs. And, you know, that those who have the power, or sorry, the luxury, if you wish, of wealth, I mean, ideally, they'll all be altruistic and would lend to anybody for any purpose, but they have choices to make, of course. And so, as you made reference to this, that if there's equity stake, if they're giving the money with shared risk and will share in the wealth and the growth of that, whatever that money is put to use for, that's more acceptable in my reading of some religious faith. But the reality is that those risks, the consequences of the passage of time, and the opportunity cost, they are of value. And it's a question of, and from both persons' perspectives, the lender and the borrower. So, you know, in the current prior talk on financial literacy, coming to an understanding of those, I think, is ultimately the thing that's important for both, you know, for the borrower to recognize, okay, there's this interest thing, but look at the value of me having this money today to do what I need to do with it, when you consider risks, consequences of passage of time, and the opportunity costs. So it's a fascinating
and this is why the common pool, if the banks, or let's talk about the credit union, the communal financial institution, should support, if, you know, the person who is I guess less fortunate, but they have some skill, they want to do some, we should support them, not beyond what they want. I mean, somebody who's less fortunate, they're not going to come and ask for millions. But if we see the potential, the communal financial institution should come and actually help them more, so that the more they make, the more they sort of mitigate the risk, they also contribute back to the common common pool of financial progress for everyone.
And I agree wholeheartedly, and there's some wonderful models of that around the world. Co-ops being, and farm works locally. Is a great example.
Exactly.
There's lots of interest, and so it's wonderful that all the money to be loaned out there is not solely held by profiteering capitalists.
Yeah, hopefully, you know. Yeah. Any other question? I can see some questions. I missed.
Yes. There's a question for you, Shay.
Okay.
From Joel Alling. Very interesting presentation indeed. Can Islamic banks remain viable without government ownership or involvement?
So, there are some banks that are private. They are just for communities within the society. But a lot of them, the origin started as a state bank in any case. So when you look at Muslim countries, a lot of the banks that were, they're national banks, but then they are allowed, let's say a sub-community wanted to do more, they wanted to have other, so they are allowed to do that, yes. But the government always supports the Islamic banks, yeah. But they can survive without the government.
If I can just ask something to both Sheikh Suleiman and Paul. I mean, we've kind of spoken generally about capitalism, but it seems to me there's capitalism and capitalism. So let me give you an example from my country.
Sure.
Now there's this notion of the free market,
Okay.
but there was a time when the United States government basically dumped milk, powdered milk in Jamaica at a price that was lower than the production cost. The result of that, to cut a long story short, was that the milk industry in Jamaica died. That was done long enough for cows, special cows, dairy cows that had been bred by a Jamaican scientist specifically for those conditions, were turned into hamburger meat. And before that, the dairy farmers had to pull the bung because you have to milk cows every day, and the milk died. Then what happened next is that once the dairy industry was killed, then the milk came in from overseas at the real cost and at a cost higher than what the local milk farmers had done. There's a video called Life and DEBT. I think it's online. Very interesting to show about how certain conditionalities affected Jamaica, particularly structural adjustment. So the issue that I'm wrestling with, that I'm not hearing from the experience of a country like Jamaica, is that this is beyond just so-called market forces, because the reality is that you have oligarchies, you have governments that can subsidize stuff, that have the power to flood the market with cheap stuff long enough for the local farmers to go out of business. You know, so I wonder if you could say something about what's really capitalism and what are the nuances of capitalism versus the kind of doctrinaire neoliberal stuff that has made so many millionaires make so much money over the over the pandemic, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one to react that as I said, I'm not defender of capitalism here, because the manipulation of markets it happens in a number of things. And I thought you were originally going to say, when you talked about powdered milk, there's a horrific case of Nestle and bringing powdered milk, or sorry, formula for new mothers to feed their children in powdered form, that led to widespread health problems because the water was contaminated with that they were creating the food for their babies with. So, I mean, you know, capitalism is wrought with horrific stories of manipulative behavior. There's no doubt about that. Were we ever content with living with it unchecked, boy, would be in a horrible place. And I'm not going to defend any one country, but I would say that Canada does a better job of that than many.
So if I may ask a question from Reverend and from Paul. So this the submission or the story she mentioned, what can we say is behind this? What was behind this killing this industry, dumping the milk, and what if we look at the bigger picture perspective? What are we going to conclude? Of course, the story was out there, but in today, let's look at why did they do that?
Well, I don't know that I'm qualified to say to go into what the US does with its surpluses and the extent to which it subsidizes its farmers while telling other people that the market must decide and you can't do subsidies. I know certainly for Jamaica and other developed countries, a lot of conditionalities were imposed once they went to the International Monetary Fund. Okay, so for me, in listening to the conversation, I would offer something which perhaps I would ask, particularly Sheikh and Amy to respond to, because it seemed to me that what these two perspectives are saying, the Islamic view of interest and the Reform tradition critique of neoliberal capitalism, is that the people have to be placed at the center of the enterprise, and that the capacity of people to remain free of debt and the priority of helping people should be what is driving how arrangements of lending and borrowing and managing finances are handled, and that the priority is not the making of profits, sometimes supernormal profit, regardless of what the impact of that is on the on human beings. I remember when the Obama administration came in, I don't know if they succeeded, but one of the things he looked at was credit cards, to go back to Julie's thing, because what was happening, as I understand it, is that students coming into university at 17 were being given all of these free credit cards without financial literacy and running up all kinds of debts, consumer debt, in addition to the debt for the courses. And I didn't follow what happened with the attempt, but I remember the conversation where the Obama administration was trying to put brakes on people just handing credit cards to people, because the parents were then now having to pick up the cost of inexperienced young people being enticed by a consumer ideology to just spend. So I don't know if that makes sense and what you feel, but it feels to me that that's the distinction. What's the starting point and what's the focus?
And if I may just interject quickly, I mean, unbridled capitalism is a lethal, horrible thing, and thus the need for government to regulate. Unfortunately, that's just the reality. They can't live in harmony without, or they can't live productively without. So both the atrocities might happen in international trade, and then the issuing of credit in a domestic in condition specifically, as you just said, it to college students. I mean, any kind of behavior like that, which is pure profiteering, is problematic and has to be. That's where the role of government and ethics and good people come in, because there's as many. Well, I won't say any more, but there's lots of very, very conscientious ethical behavior in our capitalistic system as well, but be a lot more. There is also that need for regulation, obviously.
Sahid had a question.
Sorry?
No,
Sahid.
I'm fine now. I think Paul has tried to make an elaboration on what I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So if you don't mind, I have three things to say. Number one, if we look at the world, we'll find out that different countries have been endowed with different resources, such that nobody has got everything. And secondly, the Islam, there is a statement from the Prophet ﷺ that blessed is the one who is generous in purchasing and generous in selling. So for your profit to be blessed is better than for you have a lot and there is no barakah, there's no blessing. There are a lot of people who have millions, but they're not happy. I know a 92-year-old, a big, huge business person, his own jet. At 92 years old, he said all this money that he made, he is not happy. He just wanted to die. And this is recent. And then there's also the statement of the Prophet ﷺ who says, you're not a good Muslim for you to go to bed at night and your neighbor is hungry. You have food at home and your neighbor is hungry. Okay. So I'm looking at all of this in a nutshell. I'm saying our living in this world should be for the good of all humanity. If we respect each other, yes, traditions are such that if today you go to certain villages, they have the resources, like a country called Niger in northern Nigeria, they've got the best uranium, but the people just live, they do their farming, they have their cattle. That is the lifestyle they wanted to So the governments, those who are in power, they negotiate with other countries, they sell the uranium, they can do weapons or whatever it is, and the resources is not distributed. The fact that they chose a lifestyle doesn't mean they're lazy or they don't have the ability, right? But this is the way, people choose to live their lives. Of course, we all have to advance. Yes, certain countries have advanced faster. And so this killing some industry, it has become, we know the story of Coke and Pepsi. This is not for the good of not to say that I drink Coke or I drink Pepsi, but I'm saying if we want to advance, we should advance reasonably, but not to the detriment of our neighbors. And everybody in this world we should live as neighbors. So there's no reason to kill the milk industry when later on I was going to ask Reverend whether the milk that started coming from overseas, was it organic? Was it the same as and today everybody wanted to go back to organic and it's so expensive. Why? Because in trying to advance, to invent the cars, the aeroplanes, we almost forgot that we came from the earth. And now there's no way to go, and when we extract everything and we take it, it's gone, we don't have it. But God so kind, this earth renews itself, so some countries that you never expected, there are resources you go tomorrow and you find. So now the resources, God renews, but at least we have to live with the consequences of our actions. There's no reason. Look at Jamaica, so close to the United States. Instead of trading, okay, let's get the cow milk and let's give you something, you wanted to kill the industry. So you ended up, there is a cost to even bring the milk from the States. I'm not picking on this, but I'm saying overall in the whole world, we have not lived as for the goodness of all of us. And so you find things like this, and we still don't learn, we continue to do that. The fact that we want to make the most profit, we're going to kill others who don't, and this is not good for humanity. So eventually, if we all live, yes, definitely some people will be richer than others, but at least even the poor people will be reasonably, rich enough that they're not poor. So that's just what I wanted to add. Yes.
Well, thank you, friends. We have gone about 15 minutes over, and I don't want to keep you. But I want to thank everyone, Julie, for talking about intergenerational wealth and the need for financial literacy. I think Marcus Garvey will agree with you, because Marcus Garvey was very clear that people of African descent needed to have financial freedom.
Amen.
That's a whole other story. We want to thank Amy also for taking on the Accra Confession and the section of the Reformed Church's critique of neoliberal capitalism. To thank Sheikh Suleiman for helping us understand more about the Islamic view of lending and borrowing at interest and what that means for dealing with mortgages, and to Paul Callahan and Catherine Morton Richards for weighing in to this wonderful conversation. We have recorded this conversation, and we will have it up on the website in due course. I hope that this can become a resource for other conversations that you may have. I want to thank all the audience members for participating, for the questions and the comments, and may the conversation continue. Thank you. I hope you'll have a peaceful night and be safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you
Thanks.
all. Yes. And hope
Good
to
night.
see you again, all again. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Have a good night.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good
Have a
night.
good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.